Hello, everyone, and welcome to our collector salon on Kashmir Shawls with Romi Lamba. My name is Trina, and on behalf of myself and my global team members based throughout Hong Kong, Taipei, and London, we would like to welcome you all for joining our first ever virtual lecture in our collector salon series. First off, we'd love to hear from you all. Please drop us a message in the chat box below to let us know where you're joining from today. For those of you who might be new to our program, Asia Art Hong Kong, previously known as Asia Week Hong Kong, is an annual festival currently in our 9th year running. Asia Art Hong Kong provides diverse educational programs on Asian art, culture, and heritage. We work closely with art museums, auction houses, art galleries, cultural institutions, and art societies, focusing on the education and teaching of antiques to contemporary arts. Moving forward this year, we will offer monthly online programs, including a World Musea Forum, set to launch next month to hear and connect with the top 21 museums from around the world. Our first speaker for the World Musea Forum will be Willem van Gogh at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. I am really pleased to introduce our first speaker in our Collector Salon series, Mr. Romi Lamba. He currently lives in Hong Kong and he works in finance. Romi began collecting antiques fresh out of university. He would go antiquing in the shops in Philadelphia to locate Japanese Satsuma porcelain and other various antiques and items. Eventually, he became an avid collector of Kashmir and European shawls, particularly paisley or botte pattern shawls, which he has now been collecting for the past 30 years. Before we begin Romi's talk, please feel free to type any questions you might have in the chat box below. We're going to save your questions for after Romi's talk, which should last roughly 45 minutes, and then we can have some Q&A time with him. I'm very excited to see Romi's collection today. So now, without further ado, I'd like to pass over to him to begin. Thank you so much, Romi.
Thank you, Trina. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So welcome, everyone. I know there are people present today from the US, from the UK, from India, from Macau, from Hong Kong, and great for you all to join. Today, I'm going to give a PowerPoint presentation of around 50 plus of my shawls that I had professionally photographed recently by a gentleman named William Ward, my photographer in Hong Kong, for this purpose. And I'm excited to be here. I have to say it's 6 p.m., so I am sipping some wine. My older sister, Rashmi, who's on the call, tried to discourage me. She also asked me to smile, which I generally don't do. But I will sip wine and I will try and smile. So that's the compromise. So at this point, I would like to share my screen and go to the PowerPoint that I'm going to speak to today. And the name is a little misleading, although we call it the Kashmir Shawl or the Kashmir Shawl. It's really about both Indian and European shawls. And it's about 100 years of history, starting around 1800 and ending in 1900. And arguably, this 100 years produced some of the most exciting textiles, quite unique, the type of weaving, the type of detail. And there was a backdrop of fashion, geopolitics, competition, rivalries, exports, imports, and we'll talk about some of that. And the first slide here shows you a painting by John Singer Sargent. It's actually the same person, his niece, painted several times over, and she's wearing one of the early shawls. The painting was done in 1908. But if we really want to talk about shawls, we should start with the Mughal period in the 16th and 17th centuries. In the Mughal period, and probably a bit after that, the men got to wear all the exciting stuff. The men wore the shawls around their waist called patkas. They wore the jewelry. I don't know what the women were doing. They were probably staying home and enjoying themselves one way or the other. but it is the men that you see in the images. Here you have a couple of examples of Mughal drawings from the 17th century and the 18th century. And what you can see here around the waist and other parts of their outfits is very, very early, almost before shawls as we know them today existed. But the weaving of these patkas worn around their waist, and also the kind of pashmina that they used, was a forerunner of what came later. And here's another example. In the first quarter of 19th century, this particular image is in the San Diego Museum. And here you can see both the clothes that the men are wearing, as well as some of them are wearing shawls while they sit around and smoke in their hookah, is a good example of very early shawl production. Now we move on. All of these shawls, with one exception, I point that out later, are from my collection. And this is one of the very early, what we call Kanye Weave on Pashmina. Now, Kanye, in India, people sometimes refer to it as Jamewaar, but technically Kanye is the technique used, the weaving technique in these Indian shawls. And later on, it was copied by France. And you'll see a portrait here of a German princess in 1828 wearing a somewhat similar stole. This is not quite a shawl. This is a stole, so it's a narrower than your typical shawl that came later. And you can see the beginning of the pattern where the center was very large and open spaced and woven from a very fine pashmina. And the ends had bows, which is another word for paisley. People debate the origin of paisley, when and where it came from. The name Paisley, I'll talk about later, comes from the town of Paisley in Scotland, much later in the 19th century, which was one of the European manufacturing centers. And Paisleys, of course, have become a big part of our design experience in fashion and clothing up to today, whether it's ties or all kinds of clothes that we wear that have paisleys. Now, this is a French shawl that is silk and wool. There was a Franco-Prussian or some kind of war, German war going on in the early part of the 19th century. So the French couldn't actually get their hands on the pashmina directly from India. So they had to buy it from Iran or from Moscow, and they improvised. They used a lot of silk in those days in their early shawls. And until about 1830, 1840, the French shawls, like the Indian shawls, were hand woven. Later on, they invented the Jacquard Loom, and that gave them a lot of flexibility in the design of the second half of the 19th century. But here you can see something quite similar to an Indian shawl, except the center has more silk than you would find in India. And you have these patterns of paisleys, usually a wide paisley or a long paisley towards the end of the shawls, and narrower, a border of paisley towards the center of the shawl, and still a very wide center. Now, this is the important part, which is where fashion comes in. In the end of the 18th century, very early the 19th century, somebody gave some shawls to Napoleon, and he passed them on to Empress Josephine, who was kind of the Princess Diana of her age. And she took to these shawls and really liked them. This is what's called the Empire period. And you can see in this portrait on the left, where she's wearing some shawls, a couple of them. On the right is a silk and wool shawl from my collection that is quite similar to what Josephine is wearing. And these shawls became all the rage in France once she started wearing them. And there was a huge demand. The French copies were considered slightly inferior. The Indian originals were much more popular and there was more demand for them, but they were not cheap. They probably cost the same as a fur coat or a piece of jewelry, and they were very valued. Now here you will see the artist Ong, who's quite well known. And these are two paintings he did in 1805 and 1811 of fashionable ladies in Europe wearing shawls at this moment in time. This is another shawl, it's French, silk and wool with bird details. And so if you look at this image here, or you look at this image here, which is the borders of the shawl, you can see these birds, both at the top of the paisleys and down here at the bottom of the paisleys, so roughly in the borders of the shawls, which give it quite an unusual perspective, as you don't always find, the shawls were not always figurative, they were much more pattern oriented. Now we're moving on to two separate shawls. These are both from India. One is dated early part of the 19th century, has a red center. The other one is probably 10, 20 years later. And what you will see here is a little bit of an evolution in the design of the shawl. The top shawl, which is earlier, has a much larger center. The four paisleys at the corners of the center were embroidered. The rest of it is Kani woven. And this is quite common in Indian shawls, where for some reason they would embroider the paisleys that made their way into the center of the shawls, but they would weave the rest of the shawl, usually in one piece. And later on, here the borders of the shawl, the red you see at the top and the bottom, are quite simple. Later on, the borders became more complicated, and these borders were also embroidered and added on to the shawl, but they were very much part of the shawl design. So on the right, you will see the earlier of the Kani shawls, and on the left, there's a grumpy looking lady who is carrying a shawl that is quite similar. And these paintings help us date the shawls, although there are other ways to also date them. And these are the same two shawls. Again, on the left is the earlier shawl. On the right, you can see the pattern of the bottes themselves, as well as the overall shawl started becoming quite a bit more complicated. Now, this is a shawl manufactured in India, but it was designed for the French market. And it's actually intentionally designed this way. It's meant to be folded diagonally. It has a bird's egg blue center. And so when you wore it over your shoulder, you probably wear it in a way where you can see the long paisleys, and those short paisleys will be folded underneath the shorter border. And it's quite an attractive early specimen. The borders here, again, are solid, the same solid blue. So they hadn't, and this doesn't have any paisleys in the center. This is a European shawl, either from France or Norwich or Edinburgh. So when they started copying shawls in Europe, they had a few centers where they started. The finer shawls were in France, in particular in Paris and Lyon. There's a textile museum in Lyon. If any of you ever go to that city, I highly recommend it. They have a Jacquard Loom. And then in England, the shawls were manufactured in Norwich, as well as in Edinburgh. And I mentioned Paisley, the town of Paisley, where its name was adopted. But this is a somewhat unusual shawl. It dates back to 1810, 1830. But you can see the center is in very good condition, no blemishes and no holes. And the border is not your typical Paisley pattern. It actually is slightly modified. And that's part of the reason people find it a little bit hard to identify. Now, some of you are going to ask, what made myself and my wife collect shawls? And I'd like to use this shawl as an example of what really kicked off our interest. Today happens to be my 35th wedding anniversary. We got married really young. I was 22 years old. And so back in 1986, on this weekend, we were in our early 20s. We got married in New York. On Saturday, we had the Gay Pride Parade. We walked past. On Sunday, we had the World Cup final, which all our male relatives watched during the wedding reception. So we had a bit of excitement. But more importantly, we had a carpet dealer in Philadelphia, Parvez, that I used to visit on the weekends a lot and buy carpets from him, although there wasn't enough space. And then one day he said, you know, I have these shawls. They're not really for sale, but I can show them to you. And he started showing me, and then I brought my wife and I brought my mother-in-law later, these Indian shawls, which were quite fascinating. And everything we collected, Trina mentioned earlier, Satsuma vases and other antiques in Lambertville and parts of Pennsylvania or New York, was not really Indian. And so we found that here was something that came from India, at some age, had a lot of beauty, was quite unusual. And this particular shawl is what's called a Harlequin Shaw, which means that the paisleys you see on the edges are all a different color. And that's why it has the name Harlequin. Later on, you'll see on the borders, those borders are often referred to as Harlequin. And this shawl used to be longer. We made it a bit shorter. We changed the center from red to white or off-white. It was in pretty poor condition. We sent it back to India and had it repaired. And we still have the shawl, and it's still one of our favorites. On the left here, you have a painting from the Met Museum in New York, which is quite similar to the shawl, except it has a yellow center, whereas on the right, this one has an off-white center. It also comes a lot later. But you'll still see that with this shawl, we're seeing the center that remains large. We're seeing those paisley borders that are embroidered. So the patterns until about 1830, 1840 remain quite similar. Now we're switching gears slightly to a type of striped shawl from Kashmir that is also called a Katras Shawl. And I bought this quite recently. The gentleman I bought it from India. Over the years, we've continued to collect shawl from dealers in India and France, primarily, a little bit in England, mainly online. And you'll see here in the bottom right, an embroidery. He claimed this was done for the Nizam of Hyderabad. So take that with a grain of salt. But these striped shawls are quite beautiful and quite intricate. And they were made mainly for the Indian market. In those days, these long shawls, or chadars, as they're sometimes called, were around 9 feet to 10 feet long and around 4 feet wide. And later on, the long shawls became, particularly in France, 12 feet, 11 feet long, and 5 feet wide. And they can be quite heavy, quite difficult to wear. But they wore them back in the day when they invented bustle skirts, and I'll come to that in a minute, as overcoats or winter clothing. So this is a Catra shawl. As I said, these are hard to find. This is another Catra shawl, also very fine. You can see from the detail below, again around 10, 11 feet. These are also called Jamewaar. So just to distinguish, the Jamewaar, the accurate use of the word, usually refers to a cloth of shawl that didn't have your traditional borders, didn't have your pattern. It was like one big cloth. Could be cut into a men's shawl or a lady's shawl, but that's what Jamewaar refers to. A lot of people use it as a proxy for what are really Kanye shawls, which is the type of weaving I referred to. Now here on the left, you'll see another painting by Ong, where the lady in 1823, folded over her chair, is a Katras shawl. The colors are not quite the same as the ones on the right, but you can see the floral patterns are very similar. So some of these did make their way to France. Now, here's a picture, hard to date, but it's showing you how the French ladies wore shawls, and I would say this was still in the Empire period. So it was before they invented the bustle skirt, and there were many different ways you could drape the shawl, either over your shoulder, much like you would wear chunnis in India today with your salwar kameez. Now, this is a shawl that is actually two separate shawls that have been pieced together. The center is a Katras or a striped shawl. The border is a very traditional blue and white Indian shawl, both made in India. And they were probably pieced together in the past, not recently. So it's not one piece. It was never meant to be originally placed together. But you do find these shawls from time to time available on the market. This is another shawl from India. It's an unusual all-over pattern shawl, probably a little bit of piecing together. All of the elements of the shawl you can see match. The paisleys, they all come from the same shawl. But the fact that the center doesn't have a blank center, it has these four large paisleys that protrude over the smaller paisleys, make it likely that this shawl was somewhat pieced together. You will begin to see the early stages of borders where they pick up the colors in the shawls, but they haven't yet applied any embroidery to those borders. This is the same shawl, just in a little bit of close-up. This is an image from a gentleman, William Simpson. He's one of the few Brits who traveled around India, and he actually created these images to show some of the workmen. By this stage in 1859, 1860, they were already piecing together the shawls. And so many of the shawls in India, I'm going slightly out of order, took many man years to make one shawl. And so they would make them in separate pieces and then join them up, which is why you have the term rafugar here. On the right, you have a hand-woven loom, which is how they made these shawls in India. There was no weft and warp, so to speak. Unlike a carpet, you didn't have a solid warp to attach the rest of the fabric onto. It was literally taking the looms of the colored pashmina and piecing them together on a hand loom. There's a little bit of a dark side here. I think they use children and they use young people. The money these shawls made didn't always make their way back to Kashmir. And one of the reasons why these shawls are no longer made is just that the workmanship was so fine and so rigorous that to reproduce it today would be almost impossible. So now we are moving on slightly to the more elaborate shawl. So this is what we would call a Chadar Kashmir shawl. It's almost 9 feet long and size of typical 8 to 11 feet. A typical Chadar shawl, which means sheet. The width is 4 to 5 feet. Now what you will see here, this is still done in Kashmir, but the center has got smaller. The borders, and I mean the wide borders, have got wider. And the patterns have got a lot more elaborate. This is the same shawl in close-up. This particular shawl doesn't have the embroidered borders on them. We'll see those in a minute. But if you look at the work, you will see that the paisleys are getting elongated. There are other shapes amongst the paisleys. The colors are more elaborate. And part of the reason these shawls went there was to keep up with the French who had invented the Jacquard Loom. So here's the invention of the bustle skirt. The ladies in France, their fashions moved. And you can see here, these two ladies under their dresses are both wearing bustle skirts. And so the shawl started becoming more bulky, bigger. And on the right is a painting by Monet. And you can see how these shawls were worn. Here's another example of a Kashmir Chadar. The center is smaller. Now, how do you date these shawls? You kind of date them by the borders. This is still a Harlequin border, but no embroidery. You date them by the pattern. They call this the Sikh period. Some of the periods during the Kashmir days were measured by who was running the region. So until about 1850, 1860, the Sikhs were in charge, Maharaja Ranjit Singh and others. And later on, they called it the Dogra period, and so on. And so this is a good example of a Sikh period shawl that is a lot more elaborate. The inner border here has, you can see this is no longer rectangular. It started showing more curvature. You have these kind of mihrab patterns or arches that are also weaving into the body of the shawl. This is the same shawl, showing you a little bit more detail. Now, we're moving on to a Jacquard loom that is currently in the National Museum of Scotland. As I said, my wife and I saw one in real life in Lyon. They're about the size of a billiards table, maybe slightly, or a bed. And interestingly, these Jacquard looms invented by a gentleman called Jacquard between 1810 and 1840 used punch cards, which in fact were the precursors of computers. Years later, when they invented the first computer, the first mainframe computer, they would use similar punch cards involving the digits 0 and 1 as computers. But back in the day, these Jacquard looms were based on the punch cards, and they allowed you to create much more elaborate patterns. It was still before electricity, so they were machine woven, but arguably there was no electricity, so it was before machines. So the only difference is they were not hand woven. Whereas in India, the shawls continued to be hand woven for many years to come and had to compete with the patterns that the French were producing. Here's an example of a French shawl using the Jacquard loom. It's about 10 to 12 feet long, about 5 to 6 feet wide. And you can see the pattern is quite elaborate. One distinguishing factor between the French shawls and the Indian shawls is the French shawls sit very flat. They're made in one piece on the loom. They sit flat. They're lighter. And I wouldn't in any way shun them, as some people in India do, or frown on them. On their own right, many of these shawls are masterpieces. Here you can see the beginning of a border. Their Harlequin borders were not embroidered. They were woven as part of the shawl. Whereas in India, as I said, you can see here now an Indian chadar that is trying to compete with that French pattern. It's quite similar in color. The center has got even smaller. The patterns are more elaborate, but it doesn't sit quite flat because it's probably pieced together from 5 or 6 different pieces. If you tried to make it in one go, it would take several man-years. And you can see the beginning here of an embroidered Harlequin border that I was referring to earlier. Still picks up the colors from the shawl, but it has a little bit of embroidery. and it was attached to the shawl later. But everything else on the shawl is woven. Here are some details from the same shawl. This is another example of a cream center Sikh period Chadar shawl, similar to the last one, except the center here is white or off-white or cream. The border again has got the hand woven or hand embroidered border. Later on, you'll see these became more and more elaborate. And that's the same shawl in detail. This is a beautiful shawl made in India, competing with the French shawls. And you can see by looking at the work on the sides, both sides, that now you've completely lost sight of actual paisleys. You still have a background of tendrils, sometimes snake looking, sometimes architectural looking. You have these side borders here that match the inner shawl. You still have this border, the inner border, but it's very much become incorporated into the shawl. And you have a solid embroidered border. And here's a close-up of that same shawl. Now we're going to switch gears completely, and we're going to rumals. Rumals were square shawls, 4 to 5 feet square. Rumal translates to handkerchief in India. And many of these were moon shawls. And a moon shawl refers to the fact that the center of the shawl is a circle, and then you have 4 quadrants of that same circle on the 4 corners of that shawl. And this is a pretty typical early moon shawl, which one of the things I would like to point out is that we had this repaired in India. When we first bought it, it had a hole of around 4 inches round. And you can see, I believe, right here, I'm going to show you a zoom in of that original hole repaired. So on the left is the repaired hole. On the right is a close-up, I think here, of that repaired hole. So the shawl walas in Delhi would have their own stock of extra pieces of shawls, and they would match it and really do such a fine job that it is very difficult to be able to identify which part of the shawl is not from the original. This is a French shawl, probably before the Jacquard Loom. It's mostly silk, but as you can see, it's quite fine and quite beautiful. And many of the French moon shawls came across as having very architectural elements. And in some ways, when you look at a French moon shawl, it's like looking at the dome, the inner dome of some of the mosques you might see in Istanbul or Iran or India, or the Taj Mahal or elsewhere. And you can very much see that as part of this French moon shawl, which is still a draw loom on silk and wool. So it is handmade. This is an unusual Katras shawl made in India. What makes it unusual is its transparency. And so what I mean by that is that the shawl was woven. So behind the center circle and the 4 quadrants, you can still see the stripes of the original shawl. So it was woven very much with that intention. There's probably a handful of these all over the world, including some museum collections. And here's a detail that shows you a close-up of the circle and the quadrant with the stripes in the background. And this is hand woven in India. This is a recent acquisition, and it's unusual because it's not a shawl. It's actually a prayer mat around 3 feet by 5 feet. It's a millefleur design, which means 1,000 flowers. You will see this design in carpets, in very fine Mughal carpets. The difference here is most prayer mats would have had a mihrab or would have had an arch, which you would point towards Mecca. This particular prayer mat is symmetrical. It doesn't have a mihrab. So it's somewhere between a cross of a moon shawl and a mihrab prayer mat, but it still has many of the elements that you would find in a prayer mat. And here are some close-ups of this shawl. These type of shawls are difficult to find, and I sourced this one in London. Moving on, we have an unusual Indian moon shawl, which is symmetrical. So you can see the red paisleys are picked up in the red border. The blue pattern there, a trellis pattern, is picked up by the blue paisleys. And then you have the cream center and the cream quadrants that give it the appearance of the moon shawl. 90% of our shawls have not been repaired. I highlighted a couple that have been. Most have been preserved in Hong Kong, where we've lived for 27 years now. And the shawls have held up well. Hong Kong does not have a lot of insects, which helps. Usually you have moths or other insects go after the shawls. Here is an example of a French moon shawl in duck egg blue. This is post Jacquard Loom, woven in one piece. Again, arguably it has quite an architectural element to it, but it's very attractive and very detailed, as you can see. This is an Indian shawl, a square rumal, not a moon shawl, but the pattern is quite beautiful. And on the right and left, so in the rumals, it was common to have the embroidered patterns only on two sides, not on four. And here you can see on the right and left, the embroidered borders that were added later and the rest of the shawl. This is what I would call a 2 seasons French shawl. You also have 4 seasons French shawls. And they were designed so you could fold them in half, either diagonally or horizontally, and wore them 2 different colorways through the year. So half the year or different moments in time, you would have the blues and the pinks showing, and that's what would show up behind your shoulder or behind your neck. The rest of the time, you would have the yellow and the red showing. So it very much depended on how you folded the shawl, which is why they were called 2 seasons or sometimes 4 seasons. This is an unusual shawl, which is made in Kashmir. It's Indian, but its pattern is really a hybrid. Half the shawl, the more traditional red background and the black center, are very Indian in shape, in pattern. And then the rest of the shawl, the cream panels, the floral panels, as well as the borders, which are also cream and floral, are very French in design. So, and it's a very fine pashmina. It's definitely made in India, but probably for the export market. And you can see it's not your typical design. Now, switching gears, everything we've looked at so far was woven. It's either Kani woven in India, or hand woven, draw loom woven, or Jacquard loom woven in France. Now, here are 2 examples of embroidered shawls, where the full shawls are embroidered. And this was called Amli, as opposed to Kani. And frankly speaking, today, if you saw this level of embroidery, and here's a close-up on the left, is that left-hand shawl. On the right is the one with the cream center. The work on these shawls is quite amazing. But back in those days, these shawls were considered inferior. They were quicker and cheaper to make, and they made their way to the export, but they didn't command the same value as the Kani shawls did. And ever since these Kani shawls stopped around the end of the 19th century, around 1890, most of India has switched to embroidered shawls. So if you go to hotel shops at the Oberoi or the Taj or whatever, and you go into a shawl dealer, whether it's a new shawl or 40 years old or 50 years old, they're very much based on embroidery because people stopped doing the kind of Kanye Weave that was done in the day. And frankly, these full Amli shawls are very attractive. I would say very valuable, very hard to replicate, but they're not considered quite the same in terms of value and art as the Kani. This is a French shawl based on the Jacquard Loom. Again, a little bit of an architectural element, but it just shows you the Jacquard Loom gave you the flexibility of creating very elaborate designs. This shawl is one of the masterpieces in my collection. It's French. It's attributable. It's signed to Amédée Couder, which is one of the famous families that designed French shawls and exhibited them in the kind of exhibitions that they used to have, like the Impressionist art exhibitions. They used to have them for textiles and other antiques around 1855 and plus or minus 10 years. And you can see that the work here is extremely elaborate. It is a light blue center, which is a little bit hard to see, but the work, and here you look at the details of the center, and again, the right-hand side of the center is extremely fine, very architectural, and I would argue finer or as fine as any Indian shawl. Same shawl, looking at the borders, the work again, the colors, everything about it is quite amazing. Back to India, we have a square Romal shawl, later in date. This is pieced together. You can see the embroidered border is on all four sides. The colors are quite vivid and the work is quite fine. You can see particularly in the right-hand picture. Here's another square Romal Kashmir shawl from a similar period. Take a look at the borders. The embroidered borders have really become elaborate. The pattern of the shawl itself is quite different from the early shawls, and the colors are quite different. So this was India trying to compete with France in terms of maintaining a similar level of detail and intricacy. That's the same shawl. Take a look at the border I was referring to earlier. This is a striped French shawl. So on your top right is the Indian Katras I showed earlier. And this is a good example of a French striped shawl that tries to be a little similar to the Indian ones. Doesn't quite get there, but I think is a better example. Some of these striped shawls you see in the market are from Persia. They tend to be more coarse. So they're neither Indian nor French. And you can usually tell by the quality of the shawl itself. Coming back to the Jacquard Loom. So what these designers did on the left-hand side, so this is one shawl that is not my shawl. The original design was by a family called Barris, and they used to do it on paper. This paper size gouache was 17 by 8 inches. It was displayed in the World's Fair in Paris in 1855. And they took this pattern and converted it into punch cards in the Jacquard Loom, and they produced a shawl on the right that's 137 by 65 inches, so almost 12 feet by 5 feet. It's exactly the same design as on the left. It doesn't look the same because the colors have changed. It's much larger in scope, but it is exactly the same design. So you can see that the advantage they had from the Jacquard Loom allowed them to weave in one piece something they could draw by hand or paint by hand on a small cartoon. By the way, the world's biggest collection of French shawls is held by Etro, the fashion company, and many of their clothing patterns trace back to the collection they have, either of the shawls themselves or the gouaches or the cartoons that were used to make those shawls. Here's a French shawl, also from Jacquard Loom. You can see the patterns no longer resemble the original centers, and the pressure that was being put on India to create a similar shawl. In fact, that's the French one. Here's an Indian shawl from the Dogra period. Take a look at that border. That embroidered border is quite crazy. 3 rows of hand embroidery. Take a look at the shawl. The center is completely gone. The pattern is all over. It's woven in pieces, so it won't sit flat, but it's close to flat. They were very heavy and probably took 6 to 7 man-years to make. This is another French shawl, Jacquard Loom. And this is a famous French shawl. You find it in Monique Levi-Strauss's book. It's by the family Herbert, and it's known as the circle. It has a name to it. Again, the pattern was done originally, and then the shawl was created. The work is extremely fine. The colors are very fine. So I'm going to wrap up soon. Move on to the 20th century. This is an Indian zari shawl, which means the thread is real gold, metallic, golden silk thread embroidered on pashmina. Late 19th century. We changed the center. The center was originally in that dark pink color that you can see here as part of the shawl. We changed it to black so my wife could wear it. And that's called a zari shawl. You can still find them. This is a shawl from around, I've dated it 1940 to 1970. I bought it at the Oberoi Hotel in Bombay. The work is quite beautiful. It's very attractive. It is all hand embroidered. So there is no Kanye weaving in this. They had already switched to embroidery, but the pattern is picking up traces of the original Kanye shawls, very similar, large center, paisleys in the border. And then you have that embroidered harlequin border, makes it very attractive. In the late 20th century, in the last 20 to 30 years, there have been people who have tried to resurrect Kanye weaving. Some of you on this call will have very similar shawls. So this is what I would call a modern Kanye shawl. They're made out of pashmina. The work is fairly simple, but quite attractive. They're woven in one piece and they're light, so they're easy to wear. This is a lady's shawl. And this is an effort to try and resurrect Kanye weaving, but it is nowhere close to the original. Here's another example of a modern Kanye shawl. This one has embroidery woven on top. Again, probably 15, 20 years ago. Now, we're moving on to the very last few shawls, saving the best for last. In India, the most prized shawls are called dorukha, which literally translates to reversible. And they're a combination of Kanye and embroidery. So the Kanye weaving is embellished by embroidery or highlighted by embroidery. The pattern here of this particular shawl, most of them were done in the last 50 years of the 19th century, is quite crazy. It's very vegetal. It's quite free form, and so are the colors. Here are some close-ups of the same shawl. This is a more traditional dorukha shawl, which means it's got a long center. Most of the work is on the ends, but it is a complete shawl in very good condition. Now, this is the front of the shawl. And what I'm showing you here is on the right-hand side is the front of the shawl. And on the left-hand side is the back of the shawl, folded over. So what you can see is it's very hard to distinguish between the front and the back. And that's why it's called a Doroka shawl. They're considered the most valuable of all the Jamewaar or Kanye Weave shawls, and even today are very much prized. Many of these shawls over the years have been cut into pieces by family members and others, by dealers. But this particular shawl is the entire piece. This is probably one of the most unusual shawls I have. It's a 4 seasons Doroka shawl. And what 4 seasons is for the 4 colors. You can fold it 4 different ways. There's a few things that make it unusual. One is it's a Doroka shawl, but it has no embroidery. So it's actually a Doroka shawl that is fully embroidered only with the Kanye weave, which means the work is about as fine as you could get. And they were very hard to find. The border in this shawl is also woven in Kanye. It is not embroidered. The whole thing is maybe pieced together. It's hard to say, but you can see it doesn't sit flat. And here's an example, a close-up of the shawl on the left, the front side of it, and the shawl on the right, which is the back side of it. And there's no embroidery, including the border. It's all Kanye weaving, and it makes it highly unusual to find a shawl that was considered fine enough that they hadn't been forced to add the embroidery. So at this stage, I'm just short of an hour, and I'm going to stop here. We have a little collage of a few of the shawls that I've already displayed. And I will hand back to Trina to see if we have some questions.
Thank you so much, Romi. That was really interesting. We do have a few questions coming in. For those of you that joined late, please continue to send your questions through to the chat group so we can ask Romi. So the first question is, could you discuss the difference in weaving technique and production between the French and India, which you touched on a little bit, but in more detail, what's the difference between the production?
I can try. So the Kanye weave, as I said, was all hand woven. And the way it was done is you literally had these bobbins. They took the pashmina and they dyed it probably into 7 or 8 colors, no more than that. And therefore the shawls have very similar patterns, very similar color schemes. And then they created thread out of that pashmina. And those threads were put onto bobbins, okay, literally hand wrapped. And then you would have them on the hand loom, 7 or 8 of them. And you would take the thread and you would piece it together. There was no pattern to copy. You had kind of leader in the workshop, usually somebody quite old. One of the reasons the shawls are a lost art is because you didn't have cartoons and you didn't have patterns. Instead, the leader of the workshop, the design guru, so to speak, would put the patterns down in some kind of code or numerical code, and then recite them orally to the workman. And the workman would create the shawls. And every few stitches or knots, you would knot it together. You would end that piece and you would start the next piece. So it was very complicated, very intricate, and very hard to reproduce. The French, on the other hand, started off with a similar technique. As I said, they couldn't get their hand on the same quality of pashmina, so they mixed silk and wool. But then once the Jacquard Loom was invented, it was a different ballgame. They would have the thread as part of the Jacquard Loom. They would put in the punch cards, and then they had a handle, or they'd use a foot, whatever you call it, like a sewing machine with a foot stand, and they would press it, and the shawl would be created. And so that was a very different technique.
Okay, so the next question is there meaning or significance to the colors of the shawl? Are there colors or natural dyes that are considered more expensive than other colors?
I'm not sure. I think in Europe, the blue, the robin egg blue or the duck egg blue was quite prized. You often see a kind of turmeric orange or a pink or a green or a dark blue. in the shawls. I don't believe any were more valuable than others necessarily. One interesting fact is the moths seem to love black. So when you have a embroidered border to the shawls, very often the black squares or the black little panels are eaten up, whereas the other colors are not. So I'm not sure what that's about.
I really enjoyed the striped Katras one that you showed with the duck egg blue. That was a really stunning piece. So the next question, approximately how much does an Omli embroidered shawl cost? Just approximate.
So
I suppose it would depend on the...
Let me address the cost a bit. Broadly speaking, when you're talking about antique shawls and you don't have an unscrupulous dealer in one of the Delhi hotels or Bombay hotels, very often they will try and pass off a European shawl as an Indian shawl. They don't have to, because there's nothing wrong with the European shawls. It's just a lot of people are looking for a Jamewaar shawl. So I would advise you to be careful to look at the back of the shawl. If it's very smooth, in fact, those Jacquard Loom shawls are quite smooth. The back of the shawl is quite smooth, whereas a Kanye Weave or a Jamewaar is very messy because of the type of knotting that was done. And so an antique shawl, depending on whether it's cut or whether it's full, if it's cut, it's probably going to be 3 by 5 feet. If it's a full shawl, it could be 10 by 12 feet. Can range anywhere from 1 to 10,000 US dollars in general. The cut shawls can sometimes be a little bit cheaper. That's generally for Kanye Weave. Omli shawls or embroidered shawls are more complicated because you can find examples from 20, 30, 40 years ago for as little as 500 US dollars. So it's best to try and deal with a shawl dealer who's honest and is telling you what you're buying exactly. Now, when we come to those new Kanye shawls, the more recent ones that people have been buying, they range from around 500 US to over 1,000 US, maybe sometimes 1,500 US. You will notice there's one word I have not used at all intentionally during my talk, which is the word chatouche, okay? Because those shawls are banned. Some people have them, or at least the newer ones are banned. And frankly, the reason they're banned is because there were dealers who were killing the goats, who were protected animals, and rather than shaving the wool off, because that took too long. But occasionally you can still find, say, the new Kanye shawl, ostensibly in a chatouche, maybe 2,000 US dollars or whatever. So broadly speaking, anything that is not antique would be 1,500 US or less.
Thank you. So the next question is, have you ever found two works with the same weave design? Is it common to find the same design?
It is not. They did make shawls sometimes as pairs, but to actually find an example of the identical pair would be quite hard, I believe. I haven't found one. I do have a pair of carpets that are paisley designed that are identical, but not in shawls. The weave varies. I mean, there are some very common patterns that I haven't put as part of this display that came later, which will have a black center, and the shawl is mainly maroon, and the weaves can be quite similar, but I wouldn't say they were identical.
Okay. Someone else is saying, great lecture and superb collection. Could you tell us how you store these textiles in the humid weather of Hong Kong?
As I said, Hong Kong is not bad. It's a lot better than like India, or we have a home in Bali. We haven't stored shawls there, but I would imagine it's more difficult. So we also collect paintings. And so we have a lot of, in Hong Kong, we call them dehumidifiers, one in every room. So it does help to moderate the humidity, but mostly it's the insects you have to worry about. And we have two old camphor wood chests A lot of the shawls are stored in that, but others are stored in the open. Nothing is on display because the art takes up all the wall space. But I do like to give talks when people come visit. Anybody in Hong Kong or anybody else coming to Hong Kong, please feel free to stop by.
Thank you. Someone is asking, what would be the main difference between the French and the Scottish or Paisley Jacquard shawls?
The French shawls tend to be finer, both because they put in more effort into the design, and just generally the quality of the design, the quality of the materials was higher. So and also they tend to be a bit more orange. So when you see a fine orange-oriented European shawl, it's likely to be from France. The shawls from Edinburgh and Paisley tend to be more coarse and more maroon, a lot more dark maroon and so on. The shawls from Norwich are unusual because they often have white backgrounds or cream backgrounds with blue patterns. And then I showed you that other one, navy blue shawl that is hard to pin down. But generally speaking, I would say the French shawls are of better quality.
Okay, and the next question, would pashmina or silk be more expensive?
Today, what people refer to as pashmina could be anything. You could go to the subway station in London and buy a pashmina stole for £5. Okay, that's not pashmina. If you want to buy real pashmina or something resembling pashmina in India today, it's sometimes mixed with rabbit. It's not necessarily a negative. That's to make it softer. It's sometimes mixed with other types of wool. But I would generally say pashmina is more expensive if it's a good quality pashmina. Silk is you didn't see a lot of silk in Indian shawls. So it's mainly in the European shawls. And today it's not really used in shawls at all, silk.
Okay, just a few more questions. You had mentioned about how other clothing designers have used the paisley or botte pattern. Do you feel that using these patterns adopted into popular fashion is a type of cultural appropriation, or it's more of appreciating the art form of the Kashmir region?
I don't think it's appropriation. If you look at Indian wedding garments, both worn by men and women, probably 50% of them will have some reference to paisleys. And then overseas, there's a few designers, particularly Etro, that use paisleys more than others. But they're basing it on their own history, on the French shawls and so on. So, and then of course, the paisley pattern itself is very common. You can see it on swimsuits, on ties, on my shirt that I'm wearing, pretty much everything. So I think it's just become part of our culture. Maybe after floral designs, it's probably the most common in some ways for prints. So I don't think there's anything negative about people using it.
Okay, and then in India, they say put neem leaves and keep the shawls in muslin cloth bags. Is that correct, or is a plastic bag better to protect from the insects?
We do both. I would probably prefer the neem leaves or camphor balls, which is another way of protecting them. I'm not a big fan of putting shawls kind of fully wrapped in one of those vacuum plastic bags. I think it's better for the shawls to breathe. However, if you are in an environment that is prone to insects and prone to insects attacking the shawls, then maybe the plastic bags would work better.
Okay, and then I have a question for you. I'm wondering, I'm sure that you check all the auction houses and follow the textile sales very closely. Have you ever discovered a really wonderful sleeper in an auction that was miscatalogued or completely identified as something different? And were you able to bag a really good cashmere shawl?
Maybe 10 years ago, not recently. It's very competitive. There's a small community of dealers that's global, particularly in India, and they are all over these auctions. And in fact, shawls have generally been undervalued, I would say, until recently. There have been a couple of auctions where some of the shawls have sold for 50 or 100,000 US dollars, which is unusual. In the past, as I said, 10,000 US dollars would get you an extremely nice shawl. So I still think they're very good value compared to equivalent carpets and so on. I personally don't go on the auctions much anymore. I have a couple of dealers that do, and they will sometimes show me what they have. In France, there are regional auctions. I don't go on them, but they do, and which can produce interesting examples.
Okay, great. Let's see. We just got. Are you able to hang them on hangers in the cupboard, or would you not do that?
Displaying the shawls is tricky. I think there's a few things you can do. One is you can have a pole, a wooden pole. I wouldn't do it on hangers, but if you want to display the shawl, you could have like a curtain rod or a wooden pole or an acrylic pole, and you could take a long shawl and you could fold it over the shawl, over the pole, and that would display the shawl quite well. Another way of displaying them is actually to put the shawl between two sheets of acrylic and solid acrylic. And then you could make it a cover for a coffee table or lean it against the wall. And I think that looks quite attractive as well. But otherwise, I just fold them up and keep them on a chair or in the, as I said, in the chest or in a closet.
Okay, and then you mentioned that silk isn't used in shawls nowadays. Why not?
I'm not sure. I think there's still very much a tradition to produce shawls on wool. It could be a coarser wool for some of the cheaper shawls. It could be a fine pashmina, but you don't really see shawls as such on silk. You can see wedding clothes, you can see men's outfits, but I haven't seen a lot of shawls directly made on silk. You can see chunnis, which is a type of garment that you would wear over a salwar kameez that is sometimes made of silk or chiffon, but again, not a shawl.
Okay, well, I think we've answered all of the questions that have come through. Is there anything else, Romi, that you wanted to give as far as advice to new collectors? I know you've given some advice moving forward for people that might be interested in collecting cashmere shawls, or European shawls, I should say.
Not really. I think if you inherit something from your mother or your grandmother, it's worth taking care of it and using it, to the extent you can use these shawls, either because they're light enough or wearable enough. I would encourage people to use them. If you go to Delhi in the winters, you will still see a lot of shawls pre-COVID. And so I would say it's part of our Indian heritage, and we should be proud of it and enjoy it, because they're no longer around the way that they used to be.
Yes, I really enjoyed how you mentioned that your wife has actually worn some of the pashminas and cashmere shawls that you guys have put in your collection, and I think that's really interesting.
Most of them I don't let her wear because she tends to steal a lot of food and stuff. So I'm like, not allowed, not happening. But it's the anniversary, so I'll be polite. Okay.
Happy anniversary, you guys.
Thank you, everyone, for joining, and I hope you enjoyed the talk.
We hope you will be able to see your collection at an exhibition soon. And thank you so much for your time. And thank you to everyone who's logged in today to participate. Please join us for our next Asia Art Hong Kong talk, please. Goodbye for now.